I believe in immersion. If I go to a foreign country, as Mr. Forbes said, and if I were going to live there, I don't really want help in the English language because it does not encourage me to adopt the language that I might be operating within. And so many of us have traveled in that way and learned some words of that language because it's necessary to operate in their society. If you have a sign here that says stay off the grass in, let's say, in German, and another one that says stay off the grass in English, if your natural ability is to read in German, you're not going to read that other sign. You're not going to learn it. I've tried it with stop signs in foreign countries, and it's an accommodation that's unnecessary. It's better for people to be functioning in a common language. I think we agree with that. We've moved in that direction, at least with this dialogue here. But then how do we go about doing that? And there's also language in the bill that I wanted to point out that says such obligation of the federal government to function in English, but the obligation also shall include encouraging greater opportunities for individuals to learn the English language. So that's part of the intent here, too, is to encourage the learning of the English language, not to shut people out, to be inclusive and empower people by having a common language that ties us together.
Okay, thank you. Before coming to Congress, for a while I was a school teacher, and I'd be interested to hear, Steve, your take on how your legislation, or at least what the goal would be as far as children who perhaps don't have English skills, and how they would better be, they'd have a better outcome ultimately in education if they got it quicker and had to learn English more quickly than perhaps some school systems do nowadays. What would your legislation do relative to that, and what is your intention with respect to that?
Well, if it's an official function of the federal government, then it directs those functions to be in English, but it also has exceptions for the teaching of languages and the requirements under the Disabilities Education Act. Those two things are exceptions. So I don't know that it changes education much within our educational system, except our young people would be educated that English is the official language, if this bill passes, of the United States of America, and it raises the expectation that as an American and an American citizen, you have a stronger and broader obligation to learn English that binds us together. And you didn't likely hear my opening statement where I told the narrative of my father coming home from his first day in kindergarten speaking only German, and he said hello to his mother in German, and she pointed to him and said, "Speaking German in this household is for you from now on verboten. I came here to become an American. That means I have to learn English, and you're going to go learn it in school and bring it home and teach it to me." These things penetrate through the culture, and they're a very positive thing. There's nothing that discourages the learning of other languages, and in fact that's something that we want this country to do. But we want to bind ourselves all together with the common language. It's the most powerful unifying force known throughout all time in humanity.
Thank you very much.
I'm thinking about some of the bias and prejudice against the Irish. That has all gone on. But I'm also thinking about third-generation Americans today that don't speak English enough to be trained to work in a factory. It's a disadvantage for them. This is an economic opportunity to encourage people to learn English. And I don't know that there are third-generation Germans in Pennsylvania that didn't get a handle on the English language. I'd also make the point that this bill does not, and no one alleged otherwise, but this bill does not go in and amend out any components of the Voting Rights Act or other provisions that are there in statute. But what it does do, and I didn't put this into my testimony, it does address Bill Clinton's Executive Order 13166. Not specifically, but the general language, I believe, does nullify President Clinton's executive order, which essentially says we're going to promote multiple languages and utilize that and provide interpreters. This goes the opposite way. The Constitution that Mr. Gonzalez talked about interpreted into German, well, it just wouldn't be official. It would be a German version, an unofficial version. The official version would be in English, and that's a common form of communications currency. In language, it's just like the euro.
Well, Mr. King, your English bill became law in Iowa. What has been your perspective of the impact?
Well, at first there was a defiance of it on the part of then Secretary of State, and as he was campaigning for governor, the Chet Culver, most recent Democrat governor that we've had, and he, as Secretary of State, printed voter registration documents and vote and absentee ballot requests in multiple languages. And I sent a letter to him and asked him to withdraw those because it directly violated, they are official documents after all, it directly violated Iowa statute. He did not. I don't recall if he actually answered. Quite often they just don't. And so I had to take him to court, and the court enjoined that activity that he was carrying on. He was subsequently elected governor, but the Secretary of State has been bound by the law from this point. That's the only thing. Otherwise, there was an intense opposition to it of a very small percentage of people that mounted a very energized effort. And once we just dealt with that argument, it went away, and there hasn't been an issue in Iowa since then, other than the case that I mentioned.
And Mr. King, why do you think over 90% of all nations have designated at least one official language for day-to-day government operations and official communications? Are they discriminating?
Well, that was kind of an interesting piece of it too. The allegation of discrimination, then, and that must be to the rest of the world. They understand that you can't operate in multiple languages. If you think in terms of, for me, I spent my life in the contracting business, and if you have a contract, you write that contract, and if it's in English, fine, we agree to that definition. But if you had a contract that was in, say, Chinese and in French, how do we resolve that issue here? That is a private sector issue, I understand. But within the government, you need to have a common form. You've got to have something you can go back to and say, this is it. This is the official document, and we argue off it, we litigate off it, we debate off it, we provide services off of it. And so I think it's just simple, the simplest common sense to understand that this is unifying. It's not dividing. It's not an insult to anyone. In fact, the immigrants that come here expect we have English as the official language because they are primarily, almost exclusively, coming from a nation that has an official language.
Well, Mr. King, would a federal official English law affect how state and local governments operate and implement their own English official laws, or affect how they administer and offer multilingual services such as translating documents or taxpayer-funded interpreters?
Well, I don't have the number on what it actually costs us to be printing in multiple languages as we do, but the interpreters is another cost of this, and I expect we may have some witnesses that will address that as a specific dollar value is concerned. But the responsibility shifts over from what has been given to the government by Bill Clinton's 13166 executive order to the people. And, you know, up until that time, we'd always managed, no matter what we had for different languages, people found a way to do business with government in English up until such time as Bill Clinton introduced that executive order. So I think that's one of the driving forces on why we need to do this. The effort on the part of the federal government is to, with that directive of Clinton's executive order, really is to promote multilingualism within government, and that does not bind us together. If you know, I've traveled in foreign countries, and in this country too, when you see a foreign language on a sign or multiple languages on a sign, like in an airport, I've tried to train myself to be able to read the foreign language, and you just can't. You don't do that. You revert to the language you're familiar with, and you move on. So the multiple languages we offer as a government, the less likely people are to learn English because they will use the language they're comfortable with.
Well, thank you, Mr.